daring escape attempts from East Germany, 1961 to 1989. In 1949, Germany was split into two independent nations. There was West Germany, which was allied with the Western democracies, and East Germany, which was allied with the USSR. The new border in Berlin was relatively easy to escape across, and by August 1961, up to 1,700 people a day were leaving the Communist East through Berlin and claiming asylum in the West. Because of this, that same year, the East German border was abruptly closed to stop this mass exodus of people from leaving. At first, the Berlin Wall was an impromptu barrier of barbed wire and cinder blocks, but was then rebuilt into a massive 4-meter-high concrete wall, equipped with guard towers, gun emplacements, and mines. The wall was a symbol of the Cold War, dividing Western and Eastern Europe, the Allied territory and the Soviet territory, capitalism and communism. For the people of Berlin, it meant families and friends were torn apart, and heartbreak and despair was suffered on both sides of the capital. The wall was a forbidding obstacle to many people who sought freedom from the harsh communist regime. Border guards were armed, and although they were not given orders to shoot, the ones that did fire their weapons at potential escapees received commendations and bonuses, while ideological indoctrination of young soldiers tended to transform the permission to use weapons into an obligation to use them. Between 1961 and 1989, more than 100,000 citizens from East Germany tried to escape across the border. More than 600 of them were shot and killed by the border guards. At the Berlin Wall alone, 5,000 people attempted the crossing, and 100 of them were either shot, died accidentally, or committed suicide when they were caught by the authorities. Their attempts to escape ranged from being quite ingenious to downright suicidal. By armored personnel carrier. In 1963, Wolfgang Engels was a 20-year-old car mechanic and driver in the East German Army. One day, while his crew was at lunch, he stole a BTR-152 armored personnel carrier from his military base and drove it through the streets of East Berlin. On the way, he stopped and offered a group of young people a ride to freedom, but they laughed at him and declined his invitation. The police were used to seeing military vehicles on the road, so they halted the traffic to allow him to cross through the intersections without stopping. As he approached the Berlin Wall, he put his foot down and accelerated into it at speed, but got stuck halfway through. As he climbed out of the armored personnel carrier, he was shot at by East German border guards and hit twice, but he was pulled to safety by a West German guard from the other side. Engels was rushed to a nearby hospital where he eventually recovered from his wounds. He settled in West Germany and became a teacher, but his mother, a staunch communist, disowned him as a traitor and never spoke to him again. By tunneling. The wall was built so quickly that many Berliners found themselves trapped in the eastern half of the city and cut off from their friends and family. One group of around 40 young students in the West decided to build a tunnel to help rescue some of those stuck in the East. They found a basement less than 100 meters from the eastern side of the city, and in May 1962 set about work digging the tunnel. The going was tough. The soil was clay and difficult to dig, and they had no resources. A similar tunnel that had been built by some other students had collapsed, almost killing them. By chance, an NBC news producer was in Berlin looking for ways to tell the story of Berliners trapped by the wall in the East. After meeting with a group of students, NBC agreed to finance the entire escape tunnel in return for the rights to film the dig. The students spent the money on tools, food, and equipment, and even built an underground rest area that allowed them to sleep and wash down there, so they were able to dig 24/7. 1 in 6 East Germans worked for the secret police, so the chance of imprisonment or even death if betrayed was high. And so, to throw off the scent, the group changed the tunnel's exit point to a disused toilet block. By late September 1962, the tunnel was ready for its first escapees. After sending coded messages to the east over short-range radios, the first fugitives were brought through the tunnel. More than 24 men, women, and children were brought over to West Germany. Unfortunately, the tunnel had to be abandoned after 2 trips due to severe leaking, and it was only discovered by the secret police when it collapsed 11 days later. By tightrope. Horst Klein was a trapeze artist living in East Germany. He had been banned from performing his art for having anti-communist beliefs. Klein said that, quote, he couldn't live any longer without the smell of the circus, end quote. In early 1963, he made one of the most daring escapes of all. Klein climbed up an old disused electricity pylon and pulled himself hand over hand along one of the cables across the wall, almost 20 meters above the heads of the patrolling guards below. When his arms got tired, he swung his whole body up over the cable and shimmied his way along to the other side. Klein's descent wasn't particularly graceful, though. He fell off the cable and crashed to the ground, breaking both his arms. But he had landed on the other side of the wall and was now free to perform again. By Zipwire. In 1983, 8 years after Ingo Bethke had escaped East Berlin, his brother Holger decided to follow him into the West. Ingo had crept over the border on a foggy night, carefully navigated the minefields, and paddled across the river Elbe on an inflatable air mattress. Holger had a brilliant idea. He was going to escape over the wall using a zip wire. For 2 weeks, he and his friend Michael Becker pretended to be circus performers and practiced their act in a public park. They were surveying the area for the perfect place to cross and made sketches of the area too. They took along a paper target and a bow and arrow and practiced doing archery, all the time firing at longer and longer distances. When they were confident that they were ready, Holger and Michael put on electrician's overalls as a disguise and went to an empty house alongside the border. They waited in the attic for over 13 hours and kept in constant radio contact with Ingo, who was on the other side of the border. As the agreed time neared, Ingo drove to the West German side of the wall and waited for his brother. Holger shot an arrow with a thin, narrow line attached to it that was connected to a 200-meter cable over the wall and towards the roof of an apartment building. But his first and second attempts failed to go over properly. After the third arrow flew over the roof and landed in West Berlin, Holger fastened his end of the cable inside the attic, and Ingo secured his end to the bumper of his car. Using homemade wooden pulleys and with a running start, Holger and Michael took off. Unfortunately, they had overestimated the downward angle of the cable run, and the pair gradually slowed down to a stop, hanging there over no man's land. Holger swung his legs up onto the wire and inched his way across to the apartment building on the other side, unnoticed by the border patrols below. He was closely followed by his friend minutes later, and they landed safely, and he was reunited with his brother. The fall of the Berlin Wall. Towards the end of the 1980s, the USSR began opening itself up to partnerships with Western countries and adopting a more liberal stance, with a decrease in censorship and greater freedom of information. In 1989, a series of public demonstrations in nearby Eastern Bloc nations set off a chain reaction in East Germany. The people had been shown what life was like outside of communist rule, and after several weeks of unrest, the East German government announced that all citizens could freely visit West Germany if they wanted to. Thousands of East Germans crossed and climbed onto the wall, joined by West Germans on the other side. Over the next few weeks, people began to chip away at the wall, collecting pieces to take home as souvenirs, and on October 3, 1990, the Berlin Wall was officially demolished. Its destruction symbolized the end of the Eastern Bloc and the rule of communism. Shortly afterwards, the USSR collapsed.